What kind of mind walks away from one of the richest families in Europe, gives up a fortune, and spends years alone in a wooden cabin trying to understand how language works? Ludwig Wittgenstein believed that many of the deepest problems in philosophy were not mysteries about the universe at all, but confusions hidden inside the words we use every day. His life became a strange and intense journey through war, wealth, solitude, and a relentless search for clarity about how human thought itself works. Ludwig Wittgenstein was born in Vienna in 1889 into one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The world into which he arrived was one of enormous cultural prestige and intellectual ambition. His father, Karl Wittgenstein, was a steel industrialist whose fortune placed the family among the richest in Europe. Their home became a center of artistic and cultural life in Vienna. Musicians, artists, and thinkers frequently visited the household, and music in particular held a special place within the family. Some of the greatest composers of the era performed in their salons, and classical music was treated almost as a sacred part of daily life. Yet beneath this atmosphere of refinement and privilege, there existed a powerful sense of pressure. Karl Wittgenstein believed deeply in discipline and achievement. The children were raised in an environment where excellence was expected and weakness was rarely tolerated. This demanding atmosphere weighed heavily on several members of the family. Emotional struggles and personal tragedies would later haunt the household, leaving deep psychological scars that shaped the personalities of the children. The young boy grew up surrounded by wealth and culture, yet he did not initially appear destined for philosophy. His early interests leaned strongly toward engineering and the mechanics of machines. Mechanical systems fascinated him because they seemed governed by clear principles that could be understood with precision. Unlike the emotional complexities of human life, machines followed rules that could be analyzed logically. This curiosity led him to pursue studies in engineering. As a young man, he traveled to study aeronautical engineering, a field that was still in its infancy. Human flight had only recently become possible, and engineers were experimenting with new designs and mathematical models to improve aircraft technology. Working on problems related to propellers and aerodynamics required deep mathematical analysis, and this work gradually pushed him toward questions about the foundations of mathematics itself. The deeper he explored these technical questions, the more his attention shifted away from engineering and toward the logical structure underlying mathematical reasoning. How could mathematical truths be so certain? What made a logical argument valid? Could the entire structure of mathematics be explained through logic alone? Seeking answers, he traveled to Cambridge University in England, where one of the leading thinkers in mathematical logic was teaching. Bertrand Russell had already become famous for his attempt to show that mathematics could be grounded in logical principles. When a young Austrian arrived in Cambridge, Russell quickly realized that he was encountering an unusually intense and brilliant mind. Their conversations were often intense and exhausting. The student approached philosophical questions with a seriousness that bordered on obsession. Problems about logic and meaning were not simply intellectual puzzles for him. They felt like urgent questions that demanded absolute clarity. Russell later wrote that his new pupil possessed an intellectual intensity unlike any he had ever encountered. The central problem that began occupying his mind concerned the relationship between language and reality. Human beings constantly use language to describe the world. We speak about objects, events, and relationships between things. Yet philosophers had long struggled to explain exactly how language connects to the world it describes. What makes a sentence meaningful? Why are some statements true while others are false? He began developing the idea that language functions by representing facts about the world. According to this view, a meaningful sentence acts almost like a picture of reality. Just as a drawing or a map can represent a landscape by mirroring its structure, a sentence represents the arrangement of objects and events through its logical form. When the structure of the sentence corresponds to the structure of the world, the statement can be true. This insight slowly developed into a larger theory about the logical structure of language. He believed that many philosophical problems were not genuine mysteries about the universe, but rather confusions caused by misunderstandings about how language works. Philosophers had often attempted to speak about things that could not be expressed clearly in logical terms, and this misuse of language created endless debates and confusion. The ideas eventually took shape in a remarkable philosophical work written in a style unlike most books. Instead of long explanations, the text consisted of short numbered statements arranged in a precise logical order. Each statement built upon the previous one, gradually constructing an argument about the nature of language, logic, and the limits of what can be said. The work argued that the world consists of facts rather than isolated objects. Language describes these facts by arranging words in structures that mirror the relationships between things. When language is used correctly, it can represent reality with remarkable precision. But when language attempts to go beyond what can be logically represented, it produces nonsense. This conclusion led to one of the most striking claims in modern philosophy. There are certain aspects of human experience that cannot be captured by logical language. Questions about ethics, beauty, or the meaning of life may be deeply important, yet they cannot be expressed as precise logical statements about facts. When language reaches these limits, philosophy must recognize that silence may sometimes be more honest than speculation. While he was developing these ideas, Europe was descending into one of the most devastating conflicts in history. The First World War erupted in 1914, drawing millions of soldiers into brutal combat across the continent. Despite his intellectual background, he volunteered to serve in the military. Life as a soldier exposed him to experiences far removed from the quiet halls of Cambridge. Even during the war, he continued thinking about philosophy. In moments of solitude, he wrote notes and reflections that would later become part of the philosophical work he was completing. The experience of war deepened his sense that human life contained dimensions that logic alone could never fully explain. When the war finally ended, the book he had been writing was published and quickly attracted attention among philosophers. The work appeared to offer a radical solution to many traditional philosophical problems by demonstrating the limits of language itself. For him, however, the publication of the book created an unexpected conclusion. He believed that the problems he had set out to solve in philosophy had now been resolved. Once the limits of language were understood, many philosophical debates would simply disappear. Convinced that his task as a philosopher was complete, he made a decision that surprised almost everyone who knew him. Rather than continuing a career in philosophy, he walked away from the academic world entirely, choosing instead to search for a simpler life far removed from the intense intellectual environment that had produced his groundbreaking ideas. After the publication of his remarkable philosophical work, many scholars expected that he would continue developing new ideas within universities. The book had attracted immediate attention among philosophers because of its bold attempt to define the limits of language and thought. For Bertrand Russell and several other thinkers, it appeared to represent one of the most important contributions to philosophy in decades. Yet the author himself reacted very differently to its success. Instead of celebrating the beginning of an academic career, he believed that the central problems of philosophy had already been solved. In his view, once the logical structure of language had been clarified, most philosophical confusion would disappear. Philosophy, as it had traditionally been practiced, would no longer be necessary in the same way. This conclusion led him to make a decision that shocked many of his colleagues. He chose to abandon academic philosophy altogether. After the end of the First World War, he gave away a large portion of the fortune he had inherited from his wealthy family. He felt uncomfortable living with enormous wealth, while much of Europe struggled to recover from the destruction of war. Material comfort, he believed, could easily distract a person from more important moral questions. By renouncing much of his inheritance, he hoped to live a simpler and more honest life. For a period of time, he worked as a school teacher in small rural villages in Austria. The environment could not have been more different from the sophisticated intellectual circles of Cambridge. Instead of discussing abstract philosophical theories with scholars, he now spent his days teaching basic subjects to children in quiet mountain communities. He believed that living among ordinary people and performing practical work might help him escape the intellectual arrogance he sometimes associated with academic life. Teaching, however, proved far more difficult than he had expected. Although he cared deeply about education, his intense personality often made classroom life challenging. He demanded high standards from his students and sometimes struggled with patience when they failed to grasp the material quickly. The isolation of village life also weighed heavily on him. Despite his desire for simplicity, he occasionally found himself longing for the intellectual conversations he had left behind. During these years, he also spent time working as a gardener in a monastery and later became involved in the design of a modernist house for his sister in Vienna. The project reflected his fascination with precision and structure. Just as his philosophical work had emphasized logical clarity, the architectural design pursued simplicity and exact proportions. Every detail of the building was carefully considered, and the result became an example of the strict and minimalist aesthetic that matched his personality. Although he had tried to leave philosophy behind, the questions that had once occupied his mind never completely disappeared. Over time, he began reconsidering the conclusions he had reached in his earlier work. The more he reflected on language and communication, the more he realized that everyday language did not always function in the rigid logical way his earlier theory had suggested. People use language in countless different situations, giving commands, telling stories, asking questions, expressing emotions, joking with friends, or explaining ideas. These different uses of language seemed far more flexible and varied than the simple picture theory presented in his early work. Gradually, he began to suspect that the earlier analysis of language had been incomplete. This realization eventually led him back to Cambridge. Encouraged by friends and former colleagues who still recognized the brilliance of his mind, he returned to academic life after several years away. The return marked the beginning of a second phase in his philosophical career that would prove just as influential as the first. During this new period of thinking, he began examining language not as a rigid logical structure, but as a living activity embedded in everyday human life. Words, he noticed, gain their meaning through the ways people use them in different contexts. Instead of searching for a single underlying logical structure that governs all language, he started exploring the idea that language consists of many different forms of activity. This approach represented a major shift in his thinking. Rather than attempting to construct a perfect logical model of language, he began observing how people actually communicate in ordinary situations. Language was not a single uniform system, but a collection of practices shaped by social interaction, culture, and human behavior. These reflections would eventually lead him to develop one of the most influential philosophical ideas of the 20th century, the concept that meaning arises from use. Words do not possess fixed meanings simply because they correspond to objects in the world. Instead, their meaning depends on how they function within the activities of human life. This new direction in his thinking would reshape modern philosophy once again. It challenged the assumption that philosophical problems could be solved purely through formal logic. Instead, it suggested that many problems arise because philosophers misunderstand the ordinary ways in which language operates. The quiet teacher who had once tried to abandon philosophy was slowly returning to the intellectual world. Yet the ideas he was developing now were very different from the ones that had first made him famous. Instead of trying to define the limits of language through rigid logical structures, he was beginning to explore the rich and complicated ways in which language actually lives within human society. As he returned to Cambridge and re-entered the academic world, it quickly became clear that his philosophical thinking had undergone a profound transformation. The earlier work had attempted to uncover a strict logical structure underlying all meaningful language. In that view, sentences functioned like pictures of reality, mirroring the arrangement of objects and facts in the world. But after years away from philosophy and deep reflection on everyday communication, he He began to doubt that language could be understood in such a rigid and uniform way. Observing how people actually use words in daily life revealed something very different from the neat logical system he had once imagined. Language did not behave like a single precise machine governed by fixed rules. Instead, it appeared more like a vast collection of human activities. People used words in many different situations and for many different purposes. A scientist describing an experiment, a child asking a question, a judge announcing a decision, or a friend telling a story were all using language. Yet the structure and intention behind their words could be completely different. This insight slowly led him toward one of the most famous ideas in his later philosophy. He began describing language as a series of language games. The phrase did not mean that language was trivial or playful. Rather, it suggested that speaking is part of human activity, much like participating in different kinds of games. Each game has its own rules, and those rules determine how actions within the game make sense. In the same way, the meaning of words depends on the context and the activity in which they are used. For example, the word used in a scientific explanation may function very differently from the same word used in a poem or a joke. Trying to force every type of language into a single logical framework could create confusion rather than clarity. Instead of searching for an abstract structure behind all language, he encouraged philosophers to look carefully at how language actually works in everyday life. This shift in perspective had enormous consequences for philosophy. Many philosophical problems have been created because thinkers assumed that words must refer to objects in a precise logical way. When language seemed unclear, they often imagined mysterious entities or hidden structures that might explain the confusion. His new approach suggested that these problems often arise simply because philosophers misunderstand how language functions in ordinary human activity. By carefully examining how words are used, many philosophical puzzles could dissolve. The task of philosophy, in this new view, was not to construct grand theories about the universe, but to clarify the ways language operates in everyday life. Philosophers should observe language as carefully as scientists observe natural phenomena. During these years, his teaching style at Cambridge became almost legendary among students. His lectures were unlike traditional academic presentations. Instead of delivering polished speeches filled with prepared arguments, he often spoke slowly while thinking aloud about problems in real time. Long silences sometimes filled the room while he searched for the right words to express a thought. Students watched as ideas gradually took shape during the discussion. Many who attended these lectures felt they were witnessing a rare kind of intellectual honesty. Rather than presenting philosophy as a finished system, he exposed the process of thinking itself. Mistakes were examined openly, and assumptions were constantly questioned. The atmosphere could be intense, but it also inspired a generation of young philosophers who saw philosophy not as a collection of doctrines, but as an ongoing activity of careful reflection. Outside the classroom, he lived a remarkably simple life compared with the wealthy background into which he had been born. Despite the immense fortune once available to him, he preferred modest living conditions and avoided unnecessary luxury. This simplicity reflected his belief that intellectual life should not be dominated by material concerns. He often felt uncomfortable with social prestige and preferred spending time in quiet reflection rather than participating in fashionable society. At times, he withdrew completely from academic life, traveling to remote places where he could think in isolation. One of his favorite locations was a small cabin in Norway overlooking a quiet fjord. The landscape offered solitude and calm, far removed from the pressures of university life. There he spent long hours writing and reflecting on philosophical problems without interruption. These periods of isolation were essential to his way of working. Philosophy for him required deep concentration and patience. Rather than producing a steady stream of publications, he preferred to think slowly and revise his ideas repeatedly. Many of his manuscripts were written and rewritten over many years as he struggled to express his thoughts with absolute precision. The work produced during this later period of his life eventually became one of the most influential philosophical books of the 20th century. Unlike the earlier work, which presented its ideas in a strict logical structure, the new book consisted of a series of reflections exploring different aspects of language, meaning, and understanding. The writing moved through examples drawn from everyday life, gradually revealing how philosophical confusion often arises when language is taken out of its natural context. Although the ideas contained in these writings were revolutionary, he himself remained uncertain about their final form. Perfectionism and constant self-criticism made him reluctant to publish many of his thoughts during his lifetime. He continued teaching, writing, and revising his ideas while maintaining the same intense dedication that had defined his intellectual life from the beginning. For those who encountered him during these years, he appeared less like a conventional professor and more like a thinker engaged in a lifelong struggle to understand the nature of human thought itself. Philosophy was not a career or profession in the ordinary sense. It was an effort to bring clarity to the ways human beings think, speak, and make sense of the world around them. As the years passed, his reputation among philosophers continued to grow, even though he published very little during his lifetime. Those who studied under him at Cambridge often felt they were encountering one of the most extraordinary minds of the century. Yet outside these circles, he remained a mysterious and somewhat unconventional figure. Unlike many academics who carefully built their careers through constant publication and public recognition, he showed little interest in fame or professional advancement. What mattered to him was the clarity of thought itself. His later philosophical reflections continued developing the ideas that language gains its meaning through use within human activities. Instead of searching for hidden structures beneath words, he encouraged philosophers to look carefully at the ordinary situations in which language operates. Everyday conversation, giving instructions, asking questions, telling stories, expressing emotions, and describing events all represent different ways language functions within life. One of the important concepts he explored during this period involved what he described as forms of life. Human language does not exist in isolation from the activities and practices of the communities that use it. Words gain their meaning through shared habits, cultural practices, and social interactions. A word becomes meaningful because people within a community understand how it is used in specific situations. This insight helped explain why philosophical problems sometimes appear mysterious. When words are removed from the ordinary context in which they're used, they can begin to look puzzling or even meaningless. Philosophers may then attempt to solve the puzzle by inventing abstract theories about hidden realities. In many cases, he argued, the confusion arises simply because language has been taken out of its natural environment. By returning attention to ordinary language and everyday practices, philosophy could restore clarity. The role of the philosopher was not to construct elaborate theories about the universe, but to untangle the confusions created by misunderstandings about language. Philosophy, in this sense, became a kind of intellectual therapy. Its purpose was to help people see clearly how words function, dissolving the puzzles that had previously seemed unsolvable. Despite the importance of these ideas, he remained deeply critical of his own work. He often felt that his thoughts were incomplete or imperfectly expressed. Instead of rushing to publish his manuscripts, he continued revising them, sometimes repeatedly rewriting the same passages in search of greater clarity. This intense self-criticism meant that many of his most influential ideas were not fully published until after his death. During the final years of his life, his health began to decline, yet his commitment to philosophical reflection remained strong. Even when physical strength was fading, he continued thinking about the problems that had occupied him for decades. The struggle to understand language and thought had become inseparable from his identity. In 1951, Ludwig Wittgenstein died in Cambridge at the age of 62. Those who had known him personally often described him as one of the most intense and uncompromising thinkers they had ever encountered. He approached philosophical problems with a seriousness that few others could match, demanding absolute honesty in the examination of ideas. After his death, Many of the manuscripts he had been working on were carefully edited and published by his former students and colleagues. Among these works was the book that would become one of the most influential texts in modern philosophy. The ideas presented in it transformed the study of language, meaning, and philosophical method. His influence soon spread far beyond the small group of students who had attended his lectures. Philosophers across Europe and America began exploring the implications of his later ideas. The shift from searching for hidden logical structures to examining everyday language changed the direction of philosophical inquiry throughout the 20th century. Today, he is widely regarded as one of the most important philosophers of modern times. What makes his intellectual journey especially remarkable is the dramatic transformation his thinking underwent during his lifetime. Early in his career, he attempted to define the precise logical limits of language. Later, he came to believe that understanding language required careful attention to the ordinary ways people communicate in everyday life. This transformation revealed something profound about the nature of philosophy itself. Instead of providing final answers to eternal questions, philosophy may function more as a process of clarification. By examining how we use language, we can dissolve confusions that once appeared to be deep mysteries. The life that began in the luxurious surroundings of a wealthy Viennese family eventually became a story of intellectual struggle, personal sacrifice, and relentless pursuit of clarity. He walked away from wealth, abandoned academic success more than once, and constantly questioned his own conclusions. Yet through this restless search for understanding, he reshaped how philosophers think about language, meaning, and the limits of human thought. His work leaves behind a powerful reminder that some of the deepest problems in philosophy arise not because the world is incomprehensible, but because human language can easily lead us into confusion. By learning to examine our words more carefully, we may discover that many puzzles disappear, leaving a clearer view of the world and of our own thinking.